Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. Well, this is a channel that we looked at a while back. It's called Useful Charts, and if you've been familiar with my channel for very long, you know my love for history and family history and how they intertwine and how they connect everything. That's certainly true when it comes to monarchies, which really, by and large, are hereditary in nature, and they get passed down through families, and there's so many really interesting connections between families and monarchies in different nations. But here in America, of course, we don't have a monarchy. But that was not necessarily a foregone conclusion. There was a pretty strong push in the aftermath of the American Revolution to make George Washington a monarch, and if he had had any interest whatsoever in allowing that to happen, I think it's very likely that George Washington could have been King of America. I know men like Alexander Hamilton certainly would have loved to see that happen. So this is a really interesting, useful chart. This one is called Who Would Be King of America Today? So let's say for a moment that George Washington did indeed become king. And it was a hereditary monarchy which would then be passed down to his heirs. Who would be King of America today? And there's a lot of different ways to look at that. So we're going to check this out, and I'll offer some comment as we go along. I've put a link in the description to the original channel. There's a lot of really cool stuff on Useful Charts, and we will probably do more in the future. If you have a particular suggestion of one you'd like to see, let me know. And I've also put a link in the description to the previous video I did on one of the Useful Charts talking about the British monarchy. Let's dive in.
Today I'm going to explore the question, who would be King of America today if George Washington had been made a monarch? The first thing you need to know is that there is no easy answer to this question. George Washington did not have any biological children, so even if there had been a King George I of America, it's not immediately clear who his successor might have been.
Now, there's a couple of theories about why George Washington didn't have any biological children. His wife, Martha, he was her second husband. She had been previously married to a man named Custis. And it's through that first marriage that she did have a few children. So we know she could have children. George Washington may have contracted a disease when he was down in the Caribbean early in life that a lot of people speculate may have caused him to be sterile. There are others who actually argue that he did in fact have a biological children. There was a slave born to a slave mother and an unknown white father by the name of West Ford, who everybody said had a very strong resemblance to George Washington, and it is strongly believed that West Ford was the child of a member of the Washington family, but we don't know that that was the President and General George Washington. It could have been another male relative in his family.
That's why I've come up with not one, but 3 different scenarios based on 3 different relatives that he might have chosen. And the second thing you need to know is that this video is not meant to be taken seriously. Like all of my Who Would Be King videos, I'm doing this just for fun and perhaps to teach a bit of history along the way. Now, it is true that in 1782, a U.S. Army officer by the name of Colonel Louis Nicola did write a letter suggesting to George Washington that he accept the title of king. But Washington strongly rejected the idea, and since then the idea of an American monarchy has never been seriously suggested.
And 1782 is right at the time when the American Revolution is winding down. Yorktown takes place in October 1781. It's not until 1783 that the final treaty is signed. All right, and so there was still some fighting here and there going on in 1782, but for the most part, it was pretty well done, and everybody understood that the United States of America was going to have its independence granted and kind of forever sealed by this treaty. And so the talk was, what do we do now? You know, they're operating under the Articles of Confederation. It's not a particularly strong government. George Washington is obviously seen as the hero by everyone. And this guy who wrote this letter suggesting this was not the only person who was recommending this. There were a lot of people who wanted to make George Washington king. But to Washington's great credit, this is just one of the number of times when he kind of let go of power that could possibly have been his.
But let's have some fun anyway. I've labeled the 3 lines that we're going to trace: the senior line, the Custis Lee line, and the Mount Vernon line. And we're going to look at each one in turn. Before we look at the potential heirs of George Washington, let's first quickly look at his ancestors. The first member of the Washington family to live in what is now the United States was John Washington. He was born in England and first arrived in the colony of Virginia in 1657. There, he ran a tobacco plantation, was a colonel in the local militia, and was elected to serve in the colonial government. As a plantation owner in early America, he obviously was also a slave owner, as was George Washington a few generations later. John's estate was inherited by his eldest son, Lawrence, who was George Washington's grandfather. Lawrence married Mildred Warner, who happened to be a 12th generation descendant of King Edward III of England. This means that George Washington, like most U.S. presidents, had a little bit of royal blood in him.
And, it's interesting that you can note here that Mildred, George Washington's grandmother, died in 1781, which means that right at the moment that Yorktown is happening, George Washington still got both his mother and his grandmother still living. In fact, Washington only outlived his mother by a few years. His mother died the year that he became president of the United States. So, people, I think a lot of people have this idea of George Washington as this old man, but he really wasn't. He was 43 years old when he takes command of the Continental Army. He was a pretty young man. I mean, maybe not by their standards so much, but certainly I just turned 44, so I think it's pretty young, 43.
Lawrence died when his middle son, Augustine, was just 4 years old. So Augustine, who was George Washington's father, was actually raised by some other relatives until he turned 18. After which he inherited some of the land previously owned by Lawrence and John. Augustine married twice. With his first wife, Jane Butler, he had 2 sons, as well as a few children who died young. So these 2 individuals here were half-brothers to George Washington. After his first wife died, Augustine married Mary Ball, George Washington's mother. Together, they had 4 sons, of which George was the oldest, and a daughter named Betty. Augustine died when George was only 11. At that point, his older half-brother Lawrence inherited the father's estate.
And Lawrence, we've talked about this when I talked about the video where George Washington has this vision of his brother Lawrence in the TV show Turn Washington Spies. George Washington really looked up to his brother Lawrence. He had a lot of respect for him. Lawrence had a commission in the British Army, which was something that George sought after for a good bit of his life, but never received. And so Lawrence was somebody that kind of became like a father figure to George, who was 14 years younger than his brother.
Lawrence served in a war against Spain known as the War of Jenkins' Ear, and ended up naming part of his land after his commanding officer, Edward Vernon. So from this point forward, the main Washington property was known as Mount Vernon. Lawrence had 4 children, but all 4 died very young. So when he himself died, the land was split between the next 2 eldest brothers, Augustine Jr. and George. August Jr. was supposed to get the main property, Mount Vernon, but he opted to take a different piece of land instead, and this is why George Washington, the third son, ended up with the main estate. There is obviously a lot that I could say about George Washington, being that he is one of the most famous people in U.S. history, but let me just hit the highlights. George served during the French and Indian War, in which the British defeated New France.
Kind of started it.
He then ran his plantation, becoming very rich and becoming involved in politics. As tensions grew between Britain and the 13 colonies, he sided with the revolutionaries and was eventually chosen to serve as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolution. Of course, the Americans won that war, and George Washington ended up serving as USA's first president. Now, here's where we're going to depart from actual history and enter alternative history. Let's imagine that instead of becoming president, he was made king and reigned until his death in 1799. What would have happened next? Of the three possibilities that I'm going to suggest with you, let's start with the one that I think is the least likely to have happened. It's the scenario shown in the middle in gray.
And you're going to find this one particularly interesting because of who the throne ends up passing through. The Custis name should sound familiar if you've ever been to Arlington National Cemetery. You know that the Custis family is who owned Arlington House.
As I mentioned, George Washington did not have any biological children. However, he did have stepchildren and adopted children. After the French and Indian War, he married a widow named Martha. Martha had 2 young children from her first marriage, John and his sister Patsy. These 2 became George Washington's stepchildren and were raised at Mount Vernon.
And they both actually died fairly young. I think they were both teenagers or close to 20. John, Jackie, he was called Jackie, actually accompanied his stepfather on campaigns. And I think while they were at Yorktown, he died. He didn't die in battle or anything like that, but he died of some kind of an illness, which is what killed the majority of people in camp anyway.
John, however, died from an illness during the American Revolution. His 2 youngest children, one of which was his only son, were then adopted by George and Martha. Martha being the biological grandmother and George being the step-grandfather. That adopted son, born the same year that his father died, had been named after George Washington, his full name being George Washington Parke Custis. Parke Custis being the name he inherited from his biological father's line. When George Washington became president, young George was only 8 years old. He was raised in the presidential mansions and was thus a member of the very first family. But if George had been king instead of president, would he have chosen his adopted son as his successor, especially since this George was so young?
Now, this is the way it would have worked, say, in the Roman Empire. In fact, it's pretty common that that's what happened in the Roman Empire, is that they would adopt some member of their family, very often a nephew or something like that. Julius Caesar adopted his great-nephew Octavian, who became Augustus Caesar. Augustus did the same thing in adopting a member of his family, and so on and so forth. And so in that way, they kind of chose who their next heir would be by who they adopted. In this case, he adopts his own step-grandson since he has no children of his own, and George Washington Parke Custis becomes his adopted son, but not his legal heir, and that's kind of the catch here.
Probably not, but let's imagine that he did. What would have happened next? Well, his adopted son would have reigned as George II for a very long time, 58 years. And then the throne would have passed to his only surviving child, Mary. And guess who the Queen's royal consort would have been? None other than Robert E. Lee, the famous general who led the Confederates during the U.S. Civil War. Now, we're dealing with alternative history here, so if America had been a monarchy instead of a republic, would it have even had a civil war? Perhaps in that scenario, you would have had a Republican North separating from a royal South. But let's imagine the country remained together, remained a monarchy, and ended up abolishing slavery without the Civil War. What would have happened then? Well, Queen Mary would have reigned until her death in 1873, and then the firstborn son of Robert Lee, named George Washington Custis Lee, would have become George III.
Interesting that George III is someone who actually ended up serving in the Confederate Army. But yeah, in this case, the descendants of Robert E. Lee would be the heirs to the throne today. And I believe that Robert E. Lee V is like an athletic director out in California. And I don't know if he'd be the king today or if his father's still alive.
In real life, he didn't have any children, so let's assume in this alternative history that was still the case. The throne would then have passed to his nephew, who was the third person to have the name Robert E. Lee. But in this scenario, he would be the first Robert to have been king, so he would have been King Robert I. Now, obviously, if all of this had happened, you'd probably have ended up with different marriages, different children, and different lifespans. But again, we're just assuming that everything stays the same, except for the existence of a monarchy. In this case, Robert I would have been followed by his brother, who would have become George IV, and then by his son, Robert E. Lee IV, who would have been Robert II. Now, I wasn't able to confirm whether Robert E. Lee IV is still living or not. Maybe someone can let us know in the comments. If he is, he's currently 95, and according to this scenario would be a longer reigning monarch than Queen Elizabeth II. If he's since passed away, the king, according to this first scenario, would therefore be his eldest son, Robert E. Lee V. This Robert E. Lee is a high school athletics director and was actually in the news recently stating that he was supportive of the statues of his famous great-great-grandfather being torn down. Okay, so that was the Custis Lee line.
And like he said, that one's probably the least likely because we can see even legally that things like Mount Vernon did not get passed down through the adopted line. They went to other members of the actual Washington family through his brothers.
And like I said, is probably the least plausible of these scenarios to have occurred. The second line that we're going to look at is the line shown in red. I call it the senior line because it follows the senior most biological line starting from George Washington's father, Augustine. In most royal dynasties, if a king dies without a legitimate biological heir, the throne usually passes to a younger brother or the younger brother's heir, because kings usually don't have any older brothers. Because if you were the king, you were either the oldest brother to start with, or your older brother died without any heirs, and that's why you ended up as king. But in this case, King George I would have had an older brother with an heir. And I think there's a good argument to be made that he would have passed the throne on to that senior biological line rather than to an adopted line or to the line of his eldest younger brother. Although Augustine Jr. was only his half-brother, whereas Samuel Washington was his full brother,
I don't think that should matter in this case because we're talking about the male line anyway.
Augustine Jr. and George shared the same father, and therefore Augustine Jr.'s son, William, would have been seen as being the most senior male in the whole Washington family. In fact, George Washington's nephew, William, was the first name listed among the executors of George Washington's will. So if we imagine that William would have been the next king of America, the line would have proceeded as follows. There would have been King William I for 11 years. King Bushrod for 12 years.
Awesome name.
King Spotswood for 34
More awesome
years.
name.
And then a King Bushrod II for a nice long 53 years. And these unusual names certainly would have set the American monarchy apart as being unique. But from this point, there are two different ways that history could have gone. I think it's most likely that if America had adopted a monarchy, it would have adopted a system of male preference primogeniture, like Great Britain had at the time of the Revolution. Male preference primogeniture means that the throne always goes to a son, unless there aren't any sons, and in that case, it can go to a daughter. So this Bushrod Washington did not have any sons. And therefore, in this scenario, he likely would have been followed by a Queen Estella. Estella didn't have any children, though, so the throne after her would have passed to her male cousin named Lee, before passing to Lee's daughter, who would have become Queen Odelle. After Queen Odelle, we would get the current queen, which would be Queen Brenda. So under this scenario, we now have a Queen Brenda reigning since the year 2000.
So pretty interesting, and this is one of the things that's fascinating about family history, is that Brenda Hanson, so her name's not Washington, first of all. Her mother was a Washington. There's a decent chance that she may not even know that she's the senior heir to the Washington family in this situation. It's kind of cool to think about, and that's what I love about family history. You might have this incredible family history that you know nothing about because the names change throughout the years.
And we would have a new royal house, the House of Hanson, named after her father, the husband of Odelle. Now, at this point, I should mention that all of the names at the bottom of this chart are all real people who live in the real world as private citizens. I'm therefore not going to give you much information about them because I don't want people tracking them down and doing what Tony Robinson did in Britain's Real Monarch.
Yeah, if you haven't seen that, so Tony Robinson did this thing about Britain's Real Monarch, and it goes back to the idea that King Edward IV was not a legitimate child of the Duke of York, and so when he became king, he wasn't really legitimately the heir, and so they traced who would be the legitimate heir to the throne if he were ruled out. And they go down all this line, and they end up finding this guy in Australia who would be the legit heir to the throne today. And they kind of track him down. And this guy was fully aware of his connection to the Plantagenets and that whole line. So pretty interesting stuff.
In that documentary, he showed up at some guy's house in Australia and said, "Hey, guess what? You're the real King of England." So yeah, please don't do anything like that. Now, for those of you who are curious as to what would have happened had a male-only system been used, in that case, the throne would have passed from Bushrod II to his brother, who would have become King James, and then it once again would have gone to King Lee, although in this scenario, King Lee would have reigned a little longer, and would have been followed by his cousin's son, William, who would have become William II. But here, something interesting happens. William was actually the last male-only descendant of Augustine Jr., and therefore, upon his death, the line actually would have jumped to a male descendant of George Washington's eldest younger brother, Samuel. So even if we had gone with George's younger brother to start with...
And one of the things you'll notice, too, is that the Washington men did not live particularly long. George Washington lived as late as any of them, and he was kind of born in the middle. All his younger brothers died either before him or even the same year, and I would guess probably before him, too, because George died in December of 1799. Not a long-lived family.
And had followed a strictly male-only succession, we would have ended up with this same person here eventually. And that person would have been King Paul. He would have reigned for 20 years and would have been succeeded by his son Richard, who would be King Richard and the current king. Note that this male-only scenario is the only one in which we get a House of Washington still in place. Okay, so that's kind of scenario 2A and 2B. We still have one more scenario to look at, and it's shown in green on the right-hand side. And personally, I think it's the most plausible of them all. Remembering, of course, that none of these theories are actually all that plausible. I call this last line of descent the Mount Vernon line. And as far as I know, it's never been suggested by anyone else in any various imaginary scenarios.
Another bushrod.
Whereas these lines have.
And see, I know he thinks this is the most plausible, but to me, I don't think so. I feel like the senior line would have to be the correct line. In this case, it seems to me this one would be the least plausible.
The Mount Vernon scenario is based on looking at the will of George Washington for a clue as to who he might have chosen as his royal successor. In his will, he left the bulk of his estate not to his eldest nephew, but to this nephew here named Bushrod, a different Bushrod than this Bushrod over here. The inheritance included the main Mount Vernon property, which is why I call this the Mount Vernon line, but it also included all of the private papers of George Washington. We can therefore conclude that Bushrod must have been someone that George trusted and admired a great deal. Bushrod is also the only person in the Washington family, other than George Washington, to hold a really high-ranking position in the U.S. government. Bushrod served on the Supreme Court from 1798 to his death in 1829.
So he served from 1798, which means he was appointed by John Adams, who was George Washington's successor to the presidency. And that's not something people talk a lot about, that Bushrod Washington, who was George Washington's nephew, was on the Supreme Court, one of the earliest Supreme Court justices.
He was appointed by the second U.S. president, John Adams. Therefore, in this alternative world that we are imagining, I think there would be a strong case to be made that Bushrod was the kind of person that George Washington might have chosen as his royal successor.
If it was up to him.
If he had, what would have happened next? Basically, we just have to trace the ownership of the Mount Vernon property. Bushrod didn't have any children, so after he died, Mount Vernon was inherited by his nephew, John Augustine Washington II. So we would have had a King Bushrod for 30 years, and then a King John I for 26 years, followed by a King John II for just 6 years. If we go back to actual history for a moment, I should mention that John A. Washington III was actually a Confederate officer. He died during the Civil War. He was also the last private owner of the Mount Vernon estate.
Let's take a look at him a little deeper for just a second. So this comes directly from the Mount Vernon website. It says John Augustine and his family vacated Mount Vernon for their new home, Waveland Plantation, in February 1860. About a year later, Virginia debated secession. John Augustine joined the Confederate Army as a lieutenant colonel. He served as aide-de-camp to his relative by marriage, General Robert E. Lee. This is before Lee is commanding general in the Army. In September 1861, John Augustine was killed during a reconnaissance mission at the Battle of Cheat Mountain by a Union bushwhacker. In a letter to John's teenage daughter Louisa, Lee painfully informed her that her father fell in the cause to which he had devoted all his energies and which his noble heart was earnestly enlisted. So this is something you don't think about or hear about so much. It says here he was one of several Washington family members who fought and died for Southern independence. So, George Washington's heir, who inherited Mount Vernon, killed during the Civil War fighting for the Confederacy.
He was unable to keep up with the maintenance of the property, and so he petitioned both the federal government and the state government to purchase the estate in order to make it a historical site. Neither showed any interest, though, and therefore instead he ended up selling it to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, who has owned it ever since and currently runs it as a charity. But back to the imaginary scenario. If John had been made king, he would have been followed by a King Lawrence, or perhaps nicknamed King Larry, and then by 3 more Johns. We would have gotten a John III, a John IV, and a John V. Now, according to my research, this John A. Washington died in 2009 and left no biological heirs. So to find the most senior heir after this point, we'd actually have to go back a few generations and then trace down another branch of the family where we'd end up with a Mary Washington, who coincidentally served in several leadership positions over the years in the National Society of Washington Family Descendants. Now, I wasn't able to find her obituary, so I assume she's still living. If she's not, the next person in line would be her son, Lawrence. So we'd get a King Larry II.
King Larry
If
again.
anyone has any better information about this particular branch here, you can mention that in the comments. So there you have it. I've given you 3 possible scenarios resulting in 4 possible candidates.
So pretty interesting stuff. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. I'm fascinated by this kind of thing. We'll probably look at some more of these. If you have a suggestion for one you'd like to see me react to, let me know in the comments. Check out the links in the description. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.